Hello and welcome to the podcast. This is Ron's Amazing Stories. We have stories that should thrill you a little and chill you a little.
It's amazing.
What you'll hear are adventures sent in by you guys, classic stories from the pulp mags, and episodes from the golden age of radio. We have special segments like Ghost Stories with Sylvia.
That's amazing.
And These Are Your Stories. So settle in for the next hour and enjoy the show. One more thing. You just might want to prepare yourself to be taken away from today.
Another 5-minute mystery.
This 5-minute mystery is being brought to you by the chemical element with the atomic number 88. It is a rare radioactive metal of the alkaline Earth series.
Why is that important?
Because it has a bearing on the show.
Really doubt that.
Okay, on stage, everybody. Curtain going up for Act 2. Everything ready, Mr. Roberts?
All set, Jerry.
Okay, boys and girls, on stage. Ready? Stage light.
Hold it, Johnny. Hold that curtain.
What's the matter with you, Mac? You're hired to watch the stage door, not to hold up production.
Just the same, Johnny, you're holding that curtain till the cops arrive. Girl was just found murdered in the star's dressing room.
Murder, all right. Plain, cold-blooded murder. Cruel blow in the temple. Anybody know who she is?
Oh, she's one of the chorus line, Inspector, Sybil Lang.
I see. Mr. Roberts, I understand this is your dressing room.
That's right, Inspector, it is. Ghastly mess, isn't it?
Mr. Roberts is Johnny Roberts, Inspector, the noted tap dancer. Being the star of this show, we gave him the big room.
And you were on stage at the time the murder was discovered, Mr. Roberts?
Well, practically. I've been standing in the wings waiting for curtain.
Pardon me, Inspector, but that crowd out there is growing impatient. As long as no one can leave, I see no reason for holding curtain. People have paid plenty to get a look at Roberts.
Well, I suppose there's no harm. The show must go on.
I say, Inspector, that's sporting of you. I'll be back in 5 minutes.
The thing that gets me, Mac here swears no one left the theater all evening.
I'd vouch for that, too, Inspector. You see, as producer, it's my business to keep tab on the cast.
That means the murderer is still among us. But where, then, did he dispose of the weapon? He wouldn't have risked being caught leaving the room with it on him. We've searched everywhere, and there isn't a sign of anything heavy enough to administer that death blow.
Why would a pretty girl like that be in a mess like this, anyway?
Mr. Roberts!
Confound these boisterous audiences. Oh, there you are, Jerry.
Well, what is it, Roberts? What's the crowd kicking up about?
Look here, Jerry. A star is entitled to some rights. I tell you I won't have it. They're insisting, demanding I dance. Now, you promised me. Well, it says in the contract I MC this show. No audience is going to railroad me.
You don't mean you're going against audience will, Mr. Roberts. I thought it was the public that makes or breaks you.
Not John Robert. I'll tear up my contract first. I'll tear it up.
That won't be necessary, Mr. Roberts. That contract is going to be broken anyway. John Roberts, I arrest you for the murder of Sybil Lang.
Why did the inspector arrest John Roberts? Do you know the clue? In just a moment, we'll hear more, but first...
Tap dancing. Wow, look at you go.
Yes, for once a topic I can get my feet around.
Oh, I see how you did that. How about the story?
Again, weak on content, clues, and solvability. But other than that, it was great.
If you say so. Let's just get to the result.
And now let's see what the inspector has to say. What are you talking about? You can't arrest me. I'll sue.
Just a minute, Roberts. Why did you just refuse to dance when that audience gave you that commanding ovation? You're wearing tap shoes, so you can't say you weren't prepared.
Well, I didn't want to dance, that's why.
Oh, no, Mr. Roberts. I'll tell you why you refused. You couldn't dance. Those loaded taps you put on the tap shoes you're wearing are too heavy for nimble dancing. But they weren't too heavy to deal a death blow. You killed Sybil Lang. You might have walked away with the clue. Just literally walked right off with it. If that audience hadn't wanted to see John Roberts go into his act. Now I suggest you hand those shoes over as Exhibit A. You might find them a little too heavy when you walk the last mile.
You were right. Completely unsolvable.
Agreed. And to kill someone with weighted tap shoes. Implausible at best.
And that's being generous. Also, what was up with the organist?
Might I suggest that he was experiencing a stomach disorder of some kind?
He sure was experiencing something.
Indeed.
What's that you say?
Hello, and welcome to the podcast. Today's show is all about the story.
Ron, isn't that the goal?
It is, and today we have done it. Yes, today we have a show full of good stuff. We have two great stories from you guys, a guardian angel and a UFO adventure. Then we head into space with a battle against the Uranians.
Is there anything else?
There is. How about a brand new Our Amazing Stories about the Radium Girls?
Are you serious?
I am, and it's amazing. So let's delay no longer and get to our audiobook review with the folks from Audible. Today's podcast is brought to you by Audible. Get a free audiobook and a 30-day free trial at audibletrial.com/Ron's Amazing Stories. They have over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, computer, Kindle. Whatever you have, you can listen to Audible on it. So what am I listening to right now? Firefly. Big Damn Hero, Firefly, Book 1. Written by James Lovegrove and narrated by James Anderson Foster. Do you remember the science fiction series on Fox? Firefly was a Western drama created by writer and director Joss Whedon. The series is set in the year 2517 after the arrival of humans in a new star system. It follows the adventures of the renegade crew of Serenity, which is a Firefly-class spaceship. The series lasted but one season, but what a fantastic season it was. The problem was that Fox mishandled it and placed it on Friday nights. It never took off in the ratings. But that didn't matter to the fans of the show, and Whedon quickly made a movie version that did quite well at the box office. Years later, fans are still screaming for a return, and it looks like it might be back. Someday. Until then, we have a series of novels, 4 so far, that have been made of the critically acclaimed and much missed Firefly. Big Damn Hero is the first, and here is a clip from the opening of the book.
So here's how it is. We've been flying for about a month on fumes and tears. Zoe and I are the ones hit hardest. We carried the coffin of Tracy Smith, our comrade in arms, out of Serenity and into the snowfall, where his folks stood in silence. We did not tell them that Tracy had run afoul of a gang of organ smugglers and taken refuge with us, or that he had lied to us and nearly killed Kaylee, and that Zoe and I had both shot him mortally. As he died in our arms, he remembered when we were soldiers. We had fought on the right side, even if it was the losing one, and risked our lives to make sure everyone came back. Now he's dead, and we told his folks that he was a war hero. War does a lot of mean, miserable things to people. Makes them nurse grudges, makes them swear vengeance, makes him tell stories about how the browncoats went down in defeat. And a lot gets lost in the translation. The Unification War ended in 2511. It's 2517 now, and my memories come in waves. Sometimes I'm back home on Shano, signing up to join the browncoats with my best friends Jamie Adair and Toby Finn. We were so young, just kids. We thought war meant freedom and glory. And sometimes I still dream about Jamie's sister, Ginny, and when I wake up, my heart is as hollow as a drum. That's all in the past, and I've got way more than enough present to deal with. Inara gets these faraway looks. Don't know what it means, but I know not to ask. Still got the Tams on board, and Jane hasn't tried to sell them out since we got those medical supplies on Osiris, so that's a plus. Shepard's still reading his book of fairy tales. Zoe's still my first officer, and I wouldn't have any other. Kaylee keeps us running, and Wash keeps us flying. Is it a good life or a bad one? The answer doesn't matter. It's the only life we have. Captain Malcolm Reynolds.
While picking up cargo on Per's phone, Captain Malcolm Reynolds is kidnapped by a bunch of embittered veteran browncoats who suspect him of sabotaging the Independence during the war. As the rest of the crew struggle to locate him, Mal is placed on trial for his life, fighting compelling evidence that someone did indeed betray them to the Alliance during the Battle of Serenity Valley. As old comrades and old rivals crawl out of the woodwork, Mal must prove his innocence, but his captors are desperate and will settle for nothing less than the culprit's blood. Now, you can have Big Damn Hero Firefly Book 1 today. Here is what Audible has set up for us. They are offering a free audiobook and 30 days to give you the opportunity to check out their service. This includes free access to the Audible Plus catalog, which is updated monthly with new titles. To download your free audiobook, go to audibletrial.com/Ron's Amazing Stories. Again, that's audibletrial.com/Ron's Amazing Stories, and you too can head back to the world of Firefly and the crew of Serenity today. Thank you, Audible. And now, it's time for your stories.
These are your stories, sent by you, for you.
Our first story for this time comes from Paul Devon. Paul didn't say where he's living now, but I'm going to go with Colorado. Hello, Ron. This is a true story from my childhood that I have titled The Haunting on Rattlesnake Road. This is a fictitious title, and the actual name of the road is rather boring. I have several stories that I would like to share from this place, and this is only the first. I was born in Long Island, New York, and since I can remember, I've experienced strange occurrences. I was never able to sleep at night, and from a young age, I was terrified of the dark. Yes, I know every child is afraid of the dark, but I was afraid for a reason that I was unable to explain until later in life. There are a few stories I had while on Rattlesnake Road, but I wanted to fast forward to when I was older and things began to make sense to me. My family purchased a second home and we moved to Colorado. We lived on a ranch located on top of a hill that fed into the Rocky Mountains. There wasn't much around us, a few neighbors, our barn with our animals, and thousands of acres of hilly and mountainous terrain that surrounded our family home. There was a long dirt road that led to our property, Rattlesnake Road. It was a perfect shot of scenery leading up to our 3-bedroom home. It was quiet, peaceful, but the land was ancient. More about that in another story. I was about 7 years old at the time. This is when I began to understand that what I was going through wasn't normal. Our home was a ranch-style house with a 3-car garage which took up half the structure. The other half was built into the hillside, where you entered from the front. You walked into the living room, and you could see straight out the back sliding door into the Colorado Plains. In front of you was the kitchen, old with brick. Straight down the hallway started with my room on the right, my brother's room followed that, and lastly my parents' room on the left. The bathrooms connected and were on the right side as well, wrapping around to the back of the house. I left the hallway lights on when I slept. I was scared to begin with, but there's something that always felt as though it wasn't just our family there. One night I was up and I could not fall back to sleep. My parents and brother were sleeping, which I could hear them snoring down the hall. My bedroom door was open, and I was facing the hallway when suddenly the pull string in my closet made a click, and the lights popped on. I could see the light making its way through the slatted shades of my closet's accordion doors, and my heart began to race. Then they shut off again. The air in the room became cold, tense, almost as if the oxygen was being siphoned out. Then the silence set in. I could no longer hear the snoring. In fact, I couldn't hear anything. I looked towards the hallway, and a short black mist passed by. It had no facial features, but I could see what could have been a mouth. It seemed as if though it was smiling ear to ear, which paralyzed me with intense feeling of dread. It passed by my doorway, out of sight, not making a sound. Moments later, I could hear what sounded like the door to our garage open and closed. The air lifted, and my surroundings returned to normal. I decided that I had to go investigate. I got up and walked to the door to the garage. It was closed, as I expected. I grabbed the doorknob and was shocked. I mean literally shocked. A bolt of electricity passed through me, and I fell to the floor screaming. My parents were the first to arrive, and my brother soon after. I told them what happened. My father carefully reached out to the door and quickly pulled his hand back. Nothing happened. He opened the door and flipped on the light. Nothing was there. Now I know what you're thinking, that they wouldn't believe me. Well, that might have been true except for the unexplainable burn mark on my hand. One that I still have a slight scar that I can show you today. Paul Devon, probably from Colorado. That is a freaky story and one that has some good proof. Paul, I hope you do send in more of your stories from Rattlesnake Road. I think we'd all love to hear more about this scary place. This next story, while short, packs a pretty amazing punch. Della Coleman from Sparks, Nevada sent this in, and it is in response to a UFO story we had during our year in review. She has called it, UFOs Are Not Limited to Arizona. Hello, Ron. The story that was sent in by Silas and Catherine Greenlee was frightening to me on so many levels. While you read that story, I was taken back to a desert encounter I had a few months back. I was out there looking for small cactus plants that I could transplant. Not exactly legal, but everyone does it. It was getting close to evening when I heard a whoosh sound, followed by a darkening of the sky. I glanced up and saw a huge triangle shape. It was moving very slowly, and there appeared to be a small tornado directly below it, stirring up the ground. All of this was heading directly towards me. My first instinct was to run, but before I could move, the world went black. The next thing I remember was driving home. On the seat beside me were 4 perfect cactus plants. That night I had some troubling dreams, and I've not been back to the desert since. I'm not sure I ever want to do that again. Della Coleman, Sparks, Nevada. Della, that is a creepy story. Lost time events are the hardest to deal with because you just don't know. Was it a blackout or an abduction? Both have troubling aspects. Know that I will keep you in my thoughts and prayers, and I hope that you find the answer. I can help you with one thing. I looked up to see if it was legal to collect cactus plants in Nevada. Digging up cactus and yucca on private and public land in Nevada is a regulated activity. On federal land, permits and tags are required. On private land, written permission is all you need. Well, those are your stories for this time. If you have a story that you want to share, like Della did, head to the main website at ronsamazingstories.com and click on the story submission banner. Type your story, give it a title, and tell me where you're from. That's all it takes. We want your stories. Yes, it is our amazing stories. But just what does that mean? We have segments for your stories, one for strange moments in history, and even one that plays clips from the golden age of radio to take us back in time. So what makes this segment different? Our Amazing Stories looks at people who did amazing things. So sit back and listen to this incredible tale. I have titled this one, The Radium Girls. Now, to be fair, I didn't come up with that title. It comes from a novel by the same name by Kate Moore, which is where I learned about this story. It is a harrowing historical nonfiction bestseller about a courageous fight for justice. Let's get to it. At the onset of World War I, several factories were established across the United States to produce watches and military dials painted with a material containing radium, a radioactive element that glows in the dark. Hundreds of young women were hired for well-paying painting jobs because their small hands were well suited for the exacting, detailed work. Now, radium had been discovered just 20 years earlier by the French physicists Marie and Pierre Curie, and its properties were not that well known. Because it had been used successfully in the treatment of cancer, many considered radium a miracle element, and a variety of commercial products were manufactured in which radium was an ingredient, including toothpaste and cosmetics. The women hired to paint the dials became known as ghost girls because the radium dust to which they were being exposed daily made their clothes, hair, and skin literally glow. Many of the women wore their best dresses on the job so that the fabric would shine brightly when they went dancing after work. Some even applied the paint to their teeth because it gave them radiant smiles. Once more, the painters ingested the radioactive substance as part of their job. Because some of the watch dials on which they worked were extremely small, they were instructed to use their lips to bring the paintbrushes to a fine point. When they asked about the radium's safety, they were assured by their managers that they had nothing to worry about. Of course, that wasn't true. Radium can be extremely dangerous, especially with repeated exposure. Marie Curie, one of the founders of radium, suffered radiation burns while handling it. She eventually died from radiation exposure. Other researchers also perished. It wasn't long before the Radium Girls began to experience the physical ravages of their exposure. Among the first was Molly Magnia, who painted watches for the Radium Luminous Materials Corps in Orange, New Jersey. Molly's first symptom was a toothache, which required the removal of the tooth. Soon, the tooth next to it also had to be extracted. Then painful ulcers and bleeding developed where the teeth had been. The mysterious malady spread throughout her mouth and lower jaw, which also had to be extracted. Then it spread to other parts of her body. She died on September 12, 1922, of a massive hemorrhage. Doctors were puzzled as to the cause of her condition, and, oddly, they determined that she had died of syphilis. In growing numbers, other Radium Girls became deathly ill, experiencing many of the same agonizing symptoms as Molly. For 2 years, their employer emphatically denied any connection between the girls' deaths and their work. Facing a downturn in business because of the growing controversy, the company finally commissioned an independent study on the matter, which concluded that the painters had died from the effects of radium exposure. Refusing to accept the report's findings, the company commissioned additional studies that came to the opposite conclusion. The public? Well, they continued to assume that radium was safe. In 1925, a pathologist named Harrison Martland developed a test that proved conclusively that radium had poisoned the watch painters by destroying their bodies from the inside. The radium industry tried to discredit Martland's findings, but the Radium Girls themselves fought back. They knew their days were numbered, but they wanted to do something to help their colleagues still working with the deadly substance. In 1927, attorney Raymond Berry agreed to accept their case. Many of those watch painters had just months to live, and they were forced to accept an out-of-court settlement. Still, their experiences made the issue of radium safety a front-page story across the world. But even then, the United States Radium Corp denied its role. And the women, well, they continued to get sick and die. It wasn't until 1938 when a dying radium worker named Catherine Wolfe Donahue successfully sued the Radium Dial Company over her illness. It was then that the issue was finally settled. Now I have to tell you that the legacy of the Radium Girls cannot be understated. Their case was among the first in which a company was held responsible for the health and safety of its employees. It led to a variety of reforms as well as the creation of the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, also known as OSHA. If you want to know more about this story, I highly recommend the book The Radium Girls by Kate Moore. It is available on Amazon, and if you want the audiobook, you can find it on Audible as well. Well, that's it for this edition of Our Amazing Stories. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any ideas for stories for this segment or want to write one of your own, please let me know. I would love to work with you on your project and want to hear any ideas that you might have. Just use the contact page on the main website and we'll get it done. Thank you for listening to Our Amazing Stories. Are you ready for another story? This one is being brought to us by Gladys Goodies. Good treats for your dog to eat. They use all natural products with no sugar, preservatives, salts, or harmful ingredients. So check out their online store at GladysGoodies.com. That is GladysGoodies.com. And don't forget to use our very own promo code, RONS, to get a 20% discount on all of your purchases. That is RONS. Thank you, Gladdy.
As read by. Amazing stories read by amazing people.
This time on As Read By, we have a short story read for us by Kevin Krody. Kevin is one of the many readers they have over at LibriVox.org. The story is titled Signal Red and was first published in Planet Stories, fall of 1949. It was written by Henry Guth. This one is ahead of its time. It reads as well today as it did back in 1949. They tried to stop him. Earth Flight 21 was a suicide run, a coffin ship, they told him. Uranian death awaits them in the space lanes. But the old man Shano already knew that this was his last ride. Here is Signal Red.
Mercurian night settled black and thick over the Q City spaceport. Tentative fingers of light flicked and probed the sky and winked out. "Here she comes," somebody in the line ahead said. Shano coughed, his whole skeletal body jerking. Arthritic joints sent flashes of pain along his limbs. "Here she comes," he thought, feeling neither glad nor sad. He coughed and slipped polarized goggles over his eyes. The spaceport emerged bathed in infrared. Hangars, cradles, freighter catapults, and long runways stood out in sharp, diamond-clear detail. High up, beyond the cone of illumination, a detached triple row of bright specks, portals of the liner Stardust, sank slowly down. There was no eagerness in him, only a tiredness, a relief. Relief from a lifetime of beating around the planets, a life of digging, lifting, lugging, and pounding. Like a work-worn Martian camel, he was going home to die. As though on oiled pistons, the ship sank into the light, its long, shark-like hull glowing soft and silvery, and settled with a feathery snuggle into the cradle's ribs. The passenger line quivered as a loudspeaker boomed. "Stardust now arrived at Cradle 6. Stardust, Cradle 6. All passengers for Venus and Earth prepare to board in 10 minutes. Shano coughed and wiped phlegm from his thin lips, his hand following around the bony contours of his face, feeling the hollows and the beard stubble and loose skin of his neck. He coughed and thought of the vanium mines of Pluto and his gum-clogged lungs. A vague, pressing desire for home overwhelmed him. It had been so long. "Attention! Attention! Stardust passengers! The signal is red! The signal is red! Refunds now being made! Refunds now! Take off in 5 minutes!" The man ahead swore and flicked up an arm. "Red," he groaned. "By the infinite galaxies, this is the last straw." He charged away, knocking Shano aside as he passed. Red signal. In bewildered anxiety, Shano lifted the goggles from his eyes and stared into the sudden blackness. The red signal. Danger out there. Passengers advised to ground themselves or travel at their own risk. He felt the passengers bump and fumble past him, grumbling vexatiously. A hot dread assailed him, and he coughed, plucking at his chest, plucking at an urgency there. Dropping the goggles to his rheumy eyes, he saw that the passenger line had dissolved. He moved, shuffling to the gate. thrust his ticket into the scanner slot, and pushed through the turnstile when it clicked. Flight 21, now arriving from Venus, the loudspeaker said monotonously. Shano glanced briefly upward and saw the gleaming belly of 21 sinking into the spaceport cone of light. He clawed his way up the gangway and thrust out his ticket to the lieutenant standing alone at the airlock. The lieutenant, a sullen, chunky man with a queer nick in his jawbone, refused the ticket. "Haven't you heard, mister? Red signal. Go on back." Shano coughed and peered through the lenses of his goggles. "Please," he said, "want to go home. I've a right." The nicked jaw stirred faint memories within his glazed mind. The lieutenant punched his ticket. "It's your funeral, old man." The loudspeaker blared. "Stardust, taking off in 30 seconds. The signal is red. Stardust, taking..." With the words dinning in his ears, Shano stepped into the airlock. The officer followed, spun wheels, and the lock closed. The outside was shut off. Lifting goggles, they entered the hole through a series of 2 more locks, closing each behind them. "We're afloat," the officer said. "We've taken off." A fleck of light danced far back in his eye. Shano felt the pressure of acceleration gradually increasing, and hurried in. Captain Menthlow, the silver-mustached Jupiterian, broad, huge, yet crushable as a beetle, talked while his hands manipulated a panel of studs in the control room. The pilot, his back encased in leather, sat in a bucket seat before him, listening into earphones. "Surprised to learn of a passenger aboard," the captain said, glancing briefly sideways. "You're entitled to know of the danger ahead." He flicked the final stud, spoke to the pilot, and, at last, turned a serious, squared face to Shano. "Old man," he said, "there's a Uranian fleet out there. We don't know how many ships in this sector. Flight 21, which just landed, had a skirmish with one and got away. We may not be so lucky. You know how these Uranian devils are." Shano coughed and wiped his mouth. "Dirty devils," he said. "I was driven off the planet once, before this war started. I know things about them Uranian devils. Heard them in the mines around. Here's things a laborer does." The captain seemed for the first time to realize the social status of his lone passenger, and he became a little gruff. "Want you to sign this waiver, saying you're traveling at your own risk. We'll expect you to keep to your cabin as much as possible. When the trouble comes, we can't bother with a passenger. In a few hours, we'll shut down the ship entirely and every mechanical device aboard to try to avoid detection." His mustaches rose like 2 spears from each side of his squared nose as his face changed to an alert watchfulness. "Going home, eh?" he said. "You've knocked around some, by the looks of you. Pluto, from the sound of that cough." Shano scrawled his signature on the waiver. "Yeah," he said, "Pluto, where a man's lungs fights gas." He blinked watery eyes. "Captain, what's a notched jaw mean to you?" "Well, old man," the captain grasped Shano's shoulder and turned him around. "It means somebody cut himself shaving. You stick tight to your cabin." He nodded curtly and indicated the door. Descending the companionway to the next deck, Shano observed the nick-jawed lieutenant staring out the viewport, apparently idling. The man turned and gripped Shano's thin arm. "A light?" he said, tapping a cigarette. Shano produced a lighter disc, and the chunky man puffed. He was an Earthman, and his jaw seemed cut with a knife, notched like a piece of wood. Across the breast of his tunic was a purple band with the name Rourke. "Why are you so anxious to get aboard, old man?" He searched Shano's face. "There's trouble ahead, you know." Shano coughed, racking his body as forgotten memories stirred sluggishly in his mind. "Yup," he said, and jerked free and stumbled down the steel deck. In his cabin, he lay on the bunk, lighted a cigarette, and smoked, coughing and staring at the rivet-studded bulkhead. The slow movement of his mind resolved into a struggle, one idea groping for the other. What were the things he had heard about nicked jaws? And where had he heard them? Digging ore on Pluto? Talk in the pits? Secretive suspicions voiced in smoke-laden saloons of Mars? And the labor gangs of Uranus? Where? Shano smoked and didn't know, but he knew there was a rumor and that it was the talk of ignorant men. The captain had evaded it. Shano smoked and coughed and stared at the steel bulkhead and waited. The ship's alarm clanged. Shano jerked from his bunk like a broken watch spring. He crouched, trembling on arthritic joints as a loudspeaker blared throughout the ship. All hands! We now maintain dead silence. Close down and stop all machinery. Power off and lights out. An enemy fleet is out there, listening and watching for mechanical and electronic disturbance. Atmosphere will be maintained from emergency oxygen cylinders. Stop pumps. Shano crouched and listened as the ship's steady drone ceased, and the vibrations ceased. The pumps stopped. The lights went out. Pressing the cold steel bulkhead, Shano heard oxygen hiss through the pipes. Hiss, and then flow soundlessly, filling the cabin and his lungs. He choked. The cabin was like a mine shaft, dark and cold. Feet pounded on the deck outside. Shano clawed open the door. He peered out anxiously. Cold blobs of light, phosphorescent bulbs held in the fists of men, glimmered by. Phosphorescent bulbs because the power was off. Shano blinked. He saw officers and men, their faces tight and pinched, hurrying in all directions, hurrying to shut down the ship. He acted impulsively. A young ensign strode by, drawn blaster in hand. Shano followed him, followed the bluish glow of his bulb, through the labyrinthine passages and down a companionway, coughing and leering against the pain in his joints. The blue light winked out in the distance, and Shano stopped. He was suddenly alarmed. The captain had warned him to stay in his cabin. He looked back and forth, wondering how to return. A bell clanged. Shano saw a cold bulb glowing down the passageway, and he shuffled hopefully toward it. The bulb moved away. He saw an indistinct figure disappear through a door marked Engine Room. Shano paused uncertainly at the end of the passageway. A thick cluster of vertical pipes filled the corner. He peered at the pipes and saw a gray box snuggled behind them. It had 2 toggle switches and a radium dial that quivered delicately. Shano scratched his scalp as boots pounded on the decks above and below. He listened attentively to the ship's familiar noises, diminishing one by one. And finally, even the pounding of feet died out. Everything became still. The silence shrieked in his ears. The ship coasted. Shano could sense it coasting. He couldn't feel it or hear it, but he knew it was sliding, ghost-like, through space, like a submarine dead underwater, slipping quietly past a listening enemy. The ship's speakers rasped softly, "Emergency! Battle posts!" The captain's voice, calm, brief. It sent a tremor through Shano's body. He heard a quick scuffle of feet again, running feet, directly overhead, and the captain's voice, more urgently, "Power on! They've heard us!" The words carried no accusation, but Shano realized what they meant. A slip-up. Something left running. Vibrations picked up quickly by detectors of the Uranian space fleet. Shano coughed and heard the ship come to life around him. He pulled himself out of the spasm, cursing Pluto, cursing his diseased, gum-clogged lungs, cursing the uranium fleet that was trying to prevent his going home, even to die. This was a strange battle. Strange indeed. It was mostly silence. Occasionally, as though from another world, came a brief, curt order. "Port guns alert!" Then hush and tension. The deck lurched, and the ship swung this way and that. Maybe dodging, maybe maneuvering. Shano didn't know. He felt the deck lurch. That was all. "Fire number 7!" He heard the weird scream of a ray gun, and felt a constricting tear that seemed to belt the ship like an iron band. This was a battle in space, and out there were Uranian cruisers trying to blast the stardust out of the sky. Trying and trying, while the captain dodged and fired back, pitted his skill and knowledge against an enemy Shano couldn't see. He wanted desperately to help the captain break through and get to Earth, but he could only cling to the plastic pipes and cough. The ship jounced and slid beneath his feet and was filled with sound. It rocked and rolled. Shano caroomed off the bulkhead. "Hold fire!" He crawled to his knees on the slippery deck, grabbed the pipes, and pulled himself erect, hand over hand. His eyes came level with the gray metal box behind the pipes. He squinted, fascinated at the quivering dial needle. "Hey," he said. "Stand by." Shano puzzled it out, his mind groping. He wasn't used to thinking, only working with his hands. This box, this needle that had quivered when the ship was closed down. "It's over. Chase them off. Ready guns before laying to. Third watch on duty." Shano sighed at the sudden release of tension throughout the space liner Stardust. Smoke spewed from his nostrils. His forehead wrinkled with concentration. Those rumors. Man sails out to Uranus. Gets a nick cut in his jaw. Ever see a man with a nick in his jaw? Watch him. He's up to something. The talk of ignorant men, Shano remembered. He poked behind the pipes and angrily slapped the toggle switches on the box. The captain would only scoff. He had never believed there was a traitor aboard who had planted an electronic signal box, giving away the ship's position. He turned and saw Shano standing smoking. He walked over and nudged Shano, his face dark. Shano blew smoke into the dark face. "Old man," said Rourke, "what are you doing down here?" Shano blinked. Rourke fingered the nick in his jaw, eyes glinting. "You're supposed to be in your cabin," he said. "Didn't I warn you we'd run into trouble?" Shano smoked and contemplated the chunky man, estimated his strength and youth, and felt the anger and frustration mount in him. "Devil!" he said. He lunged then, clawing. He dug the cigarette into Rourke's flushed face and clung to his body. Rourke howled. He fell backward to the deck, slapping at his blistered face. He thrashed around, and Shano clung to him, battered, pressing the cigarette relentlessly, coughing, cursing the pain in his joints. Shano grasped Rourke's neck with his hands. He twisted the neck with his gnarled hands, strong hands that had worked. He got up when Rourke stopped thrashing. The face was purple, and he was dead. Shano shivered. He crouched in the passageway, shivering and coughing. A tremendous grinding sounded amidships. Loud rending noises of protesting metal. The ship bucked like a hooked fish. Then it was still. An empty clank echoed through the hole. Captain's voice came, almost yelling. "Emergency! Emergency! Back to your posts! Engine room! Report! Engine room!" Shano picked himself off the deck, his mind muddled. He coughed and put a cigarette to his lips, flicking a lighter disc jerkily from his pocket. He blew smoke from his nostrils and heard the renewed pounding of feet. What was going on now? "Engine room! Your screen is dead! Switch onto loudspeaker system! Engine room!" A rasping, grating sound ensued from a grill above Shano's head. Then a disconnected voice. "Get the men out of there! It's useless! Hurry it up!" A series of clicks and the heavy voice of the chief engineer. "Captain, Somebody's smashed the selector chamber. Engine room's full of toxia gas. Shano jumped. He prodded the body on the deck with his toe. The Stardust's mechanical voice bellowed, "Engine room." It reproduced the captain's heavy breathing and his tired voice. "We're about midway to Venus," it said. "There were 2 ships and we drove them off, but there may be others. They'll be coming back. They know we've been hit. We have to get away, fast." Shano could see the captain in his mind. Worried, squared face slick with moisture, shouting into a control room mic, trying to find out what the matter was with his spaceship. The engineer's answer came from the grill. "Impossible, sir. Engine room full of toxia gas. Not a suit aboard prepared to withstand it, and we have to keep it in there. Selector filaments won't function without the gas. Our only chance was to put a man in the engine room to repair the broken selector valve rods, or keep them running by hand." "Blast it," roared the captain. "No way of getting in there? Can't you bypass the selector?" "No. It's the heart of the new cosmic drive, sir. The fuels must pass through the selector valves before entering the tube chambers. Filaments will operate so long as toxia gas is there to burn, and we'll keep trying to open the valves and compensate for fluctuating engine temperature." "But the rod pins have melted down, sir. They're common tungsten steel, and when the rod pulls a valve open, they slip off and drop down useless. It's a mess. If we could only get a man in there, he might lift up the dropped end of the rod and slip it into place each time it fell, and keep the valves working and feeding fuel." The speaker sputtered, and Shano smoked thoughtfully, listening to the talk back and forth between the captain and the engineer. He didn't understand it, but knew that everything was ended. They were broken down in space and would never make Earth. Those Uranian devils would come streaking back, catch them floating helpless, and blast them to bits, and he would never get home to die. Shano coughed and cursed his lungs. Time was when these gum-clogged lungs had saved his life. In the plutonian mines, gas explosions in the tunnels, toxia gas seeping in, burning the men's insides. But with gum-clogged lungs, he'd been able to work himself clear, just getting sick where other men would have died, their insides burned out. Shano smoked and thought. They wouldn't even know, he told himself, squirming through the emergency exit into the engine room and sealing it after him. And they wouldn't understand if they did. Pink mist swirled about him. Toxia gas. Shano coughed. He squinted around at the massive, incomprehensible machinery, the guts of the spaceship. Then he saw the shattered, gold-gleaming cylinder, gas hissing from a fine nozzle, and filaments glowing bluish inside it, still working away. He saw 5 heavy car steel rods hanging useless on melted-down pins, and the slots their pronged ends hooked into. He looked at his hands and shook his head. "One try," he said to himself. "One try, Shano. One important thing in your life. Here's your opportunity. The toxia gas will get you. It'll kill you at this concentration. But you'll last for maybe 12 hours. Another man wouldn't last a minute. Another man's lungs aren't clogged with Juno gum." He grasped a rod and lifted it, sweating under the weight, and slipped the forked end into its slot. Going home to die, he thought. Well, maybe not going home. Couldn't remember what Earth looked like anyway. What was that again? Oh yeah, just lift them up, and when they drop off, lift them up again. Shano coughed, and lifted the heavy rods into position. One jerked back suddenly and smoothly, and something went pop, pop behind him. And machinery whirred. He lifted the rod and slipped it back on. Another jerked, pulled open a large valve, and dropped off. Shano bent and lifted, coughing and coughing. He forgot what he was doing. Mind blank, the way it went when he worked. just rhythmically fell into the job the way a laborer does. He waited for a rod to slip and fall, then lifted it up and slipped it into place, skin sweating, joints shooting pain along his limbs. He heard the machinery working. He heard the high, howling whine of cosmic jets. He, Shano, was making the machinery go. He was running the cosmic drive. A bell clanged somewhere. Engine room, we're underway. What happened? Silence, while Shano coughed and made the machinery go, thinking about the Earth he hadn't seen for many years. Captain, the speaker bawled, there's a man in there, working the valve rods. Somebody is in the engine room and the gas isn't. Shano grinned, feeling good, feeling happy, lifting the heavy steel rods, driving the ship, keeping the jets screaming, and hurtling the liner Stardust toward Venus. He wondered if they'd found Rourke yet. If they could keep going for 12 hours, they would get to Venus. After that, home, he coughed. Hell, who wants to go home? He plucked at his agitated chest, thinking of a whole damn Uranian fleet swooping down on a spot in space, expecting to find a crippled ship there with a spy inside it, and finding nothing because of Shano, a useless old man. Coughing came out all mixed up with laughing.
That was a great story, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. The space action scenes were spot on, and that Nick Jaw thing really gave it that spy thriller kind of vibe. No wonder this story was touted as the best of 1949 in Planet Stories magazine. Planet Stories was a pulp science fiction magazine published by Fiction House between 1939 and 1955. It featured interplanetary adventures both in space and on other planets. It was initially focused on a young readership. Malcolm Rice was editor-in-chief for all of its 71 issues. Planet Stories was launched at the same time as Planet Comics, the success of which probably helped fund the early issues of Planet Stories. Planet Stories didn't pay well enough to regularly attract the leading science fiction writers of the day, but did occasionally obtain work from some well-known authors. For example, in 1952, Planet Stories published Philip K. Dick's very first story, and then printed 4 more of his stories over the next 3 years. By the way, Philip is one of my favorite science fiction authors. That was episode number 544, and Paul Devin, Della Coleman, and Kevin Krody made this show happen. My thanks to you guys for sharing your stories and your talents. If you want to follow the podcast or the blog, head to ronsamazingstories.com. There you will find any of the links I mentioned and how to contact us. Do you want to help the show? The best thing you can do is to tell your friends all about it, and please leave reviews or feedback wherever you listen. Clicking that follow or like button makes us grow. Thank you for listening, and I hope you come again to find out what are Ron's Amazing Stories.